Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the 2022 Catholic Immigrant Integration Initiative Conference. My name is Heidi Bostick, and I have the privilege to serve as Dean of the Helen Way Klingler College of Arts and Sciences here at Marquette University. So let me gloss over my own bio and just share with you two tidbits. I've been at Marquette for 2 years, and I came here following a lot of discernment. This was the place I really wanted to be. My husband and I both wanted to be. Two of the greatest honors I've had since being at Marquette is number one, serving as co-chair of our Ignatian Year Committee that we celebrated last year, and being inducted, thanks to some students, as an honorary member into the Jesuit Honor Society, Alpha Sigma Nu. So let me just share, thank you, yes. So let me just tell you in a couple of minutes here why I'm at Marquette, and I think it really illustrates why Marquette is such a logical host for this wonderful, wonderful conference. So I came here thanks to what I refer to as the 3 Ps, the purpose, the people, and the place. First and foremost is our Catholic Jesuit mission, really exemplified by the work that all of you are doing, journeying with the excluded, those who are marginalized. And then probably my favorite of the universal apostolic preferences of the Society of Jesus, accompanying young people in the creation of a hope-filled future. Who doesn't want to get out of bed every morning and work on that? So it's really a joy. The people, from the moment I considered joining the community at Marquette, I fell in love with these folks. And so those of you who are visiting, I hope you've had the same sense. And those of you joining us online, I hope that you had some flavor of the spirit that animates Marquette University. We really have wonderful students, staff, and faculty, and it's really an honor and a joy to work with these folks every day to try to exemplify Marquette's mission. And finally, the place. For those of you who don't know, Milwaukee, Wisconsin is an amazing city. It's somewhat of a well-kept secret beyond the Midwest, yet it's an incredible city, incredibly vibrant. And those of you who took the tour on Monday of some of our not-for-profit entities across the city that are here to serve immigrant populations and others really understand how the community cares for its members. And although I would say every university claims to do community engagement, at Marquette, we really walk the walk alongside our community partners and trying to do what we can to make the world a better place. And I would say honor the call of Pope Francis to foster integral ecology. So I have the great privilege today to introduce our panelists. First, I will introduce Father Dan Grudy, an associate professor of theology at the University of Notre Dame. He is also vice president and associate provost for undergraduate affairs. In addition to his role in the provost's office, Father Grudy serves as a fellow and trustee of the university and is the advisor for discernment and discovery for Notre Dame's Distinguished Inspired Leadership Initiative. An internationally recognized expert on migration and refugee issues, whose papers and books have been translated into 7 languages, he's the author of Globalization, Spirituality, and Justice, Navigating the Path to Peace, as well as Border of Death, Valley of Life, an immigrant journey of heart and spirit. He has edited or co-edited 4 books on poverty, justice, and migration. Father Grudy's expertise in and passion for refugee and migration issues also inform his work as executive producer of several acclaimed films and documentaries. He's also worked with the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the World Council of Churches, the Vatican, and the United Nations on issues of theology, globalization, migration, and refugees. Father Grudy actually asked me to cut his bio short because his accomplishments are numerous. Suffice it to say that they keep him busy at Notre Dame. He also did a postdoc at Oxford, in addition to his bachelor's degree at Notre Dame, his Master of Divinity and licentiate in Sacred Theologies from the Jesuit School of Theology, and his doctorate in theology from the Graduate Theological Union. Late breaking news, he has a book out next month on the theology of migration, the bodies of refugees, and the body of Christ from Orbis. And after his presentation, we will have 2 respondents. Let me briefly introduce each of them. First will be Fesahai Mabratu, who is the Director of Black Catholic and Ethnic Ministries here in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. Fesahay's primary goal is to implement the pastoral plan for Black Catholics at the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. He was part of the action plan implementation team for the Black Catholic Pastoral Plan. His responsibilities also include working with Native American and Asian American Catholics. These are holy grounds, which he approaches with reverence and humility. His experience resettling Southeast Asian refugees and working with Native inmates as a chaplain has helped him to understand the spiritual and cultural values of these communities. His overarching vision is to focus on leadership development and to empower our Catholic ethnic communities to take their rightful place at the table, feeling at home in the Catholic faith with a sense of ownership and stewardship. And as a dean, I just cannot resist adding that his son is a chemistry major here at Marquette, and his daughter is a graduate of our Marquette University Law School. The second respondent will be Father John Teedy, my colleague here in the Department of Theology. He's a member of the Upper Midwest Province of the Society of Jesus, as well as an associate professor of theology. He's working right now on a co-authored book on politics, religion, and democracy in Latin America with Father Matthew Carnes, a fellow Jesuit at Georgetown, and his own book on St. Oscar Romero and his theological influences for Fortress Press. Father Teedy earned his PhD at Notre Dame in 2012 and published his first book with Lexington Books titled Remembering Oscar Romero and the Martyrs of El Salvador, A Cloud of Witnesses. He specializes in Christology and Latin American theology, and he serves on the board of trustees at Xavier University, as well as the board of directors at Marquette University High School. And in addition to these roles, he's recently taken on a new role here at Marquette as Associate Vice Provost for Student Success and Jesuit Enrollment Initiatives. So my final introduction this morning is Don Kerwin, the Executive Director of the Center for Migration Studies of New York. He's directed the center since September of 2011, and he previously worked for the Catholic Legal Immigration Network. His bio also is very lengthy, filled with acronyms, and so maybe I'll just abbreviate, Don, with your permission. Yeah, he's saying just that's fine. He has worked on programs such as granting political asylum to Haitians, and he has worked with also the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. He served as vice president for programs at the Migration Policy Institute, where he wrote on immigration, labor standards, and refugee policy issues. So he now is going to introduce us to the Tomasi lecture, and then he will welcome our speaker. So Don, thank you.
So we're very grateful to Marquette University and to have Dean Bostic with us this morning. So thanks for being with us. Let me just say a few words about the Lidio Tomasi lecture and the person it honors, really. CMS began this annual lecture in 2014 to cover a migration-related topic of pressing concern to the Catholic community. The lecture has become over the years a linchpin of this event because it reminds us of the theological, spiritual, and ethical roots of the church's work with migrants and refugees. Father Lidio Tomasi is a Scalabrini priest. He was a founding member of our Center of Migration Studies, and he directed the center from 1968 to 2001. At CMS, he founded the publications Migration World Magazine and In Defense of the Alien. He also organized the CMS annual conference on immigrant rights and immigration policy. When we were starting out as attorneys, that was the only immigration conference that existed. And of course, we went every year, and that morphed into what's now the kind of big annual conference in Washington, D.C. that Migration Policy Institute runs at Georgetown University with the Catholic Legal Immigration Network. So that's been going on for 30-something years at this point. Like all the Scalabrinians, Father Tomasi was himself an immigrant wherever he worked. He's from Italy, Vicenza, Italy. He attended the Pontifical Gregorian University of Rome, where he earned degrees in philosophy and theology, and he received his PhD in sociology from New York University. He served in a number of academic and pastoral roles over a long career, and he's received many awards for his good work. Prior to his retirement, Father Tomasi, on a personal note, would regularly visit our New York office and sometimes take staff out for pizza at John's on Bleecker Street in the West Village, which has been there since 1929. So if you ever come, I'd recommend that to you. And we remember him as a very kind of kind and supportive presence over those early years. Father Lidio is now living in Italy, and I know that he would be particularly proud that Father Dan Grudy is delivering the lecture that's named after him today. So let me stop there and ask Father Dan to come forward.
Thank you, Don and Heidi, and thank you all to the Jesuits who welcomed me last night. And whenever I come to a Jesuit community, I always feel very much at home. And you'll probably see as my reflections today are very much grounded on what the Jesuits have taught me. And though I'm a Holy Cross priest, the spirituality of Ignatius and also the spiritual exercises have profoundly shaped me and this work that I've been a part of. But I'm also grateful as well to really connect with Lidio Tomasi, because it was about 25 years ago when I was beginning on faculty that I had a dinner with Lidio Tomasi, and he was sharing some of the insights from his dissertation, which had a profound effect on some of the messages that I will also share today. So Lidio Tomasi and also the Scalabrinians more generally have been great partners, great friends throughout this journey on migration and migration studies. So a shout out to all the Scalabrinians, Pat Murphy, I know who's here, who's worked with us, but Brother Gioacchino Campesi, and many other Scalabrinians throughout the world have been very, very helpful to me. Today's topic is really on migration and Eucharist, and it's really looking at the issue of the theology of migration. And you can see on this title slide here, this is really bookmarked by two images that to me shape the talk, and the core of it really can be summarized in this image. The first is this mass that Pope Francis had in Lampedusa, Italy, shortly after he was elected. It was a few months afterwards, and he used a chalice made from the driftwood of a refugee boat. I'll talk a little bit more about that story in a moment. But secondly, on the right-hand side, about 25 years ago as well, I can remember going to a mass at the border, which some of you may have gone to, and this is a place where each year at the Mexican-American-US border, they've got one mass where they join the altar together at the fence. So half the communities in Mexico, half the communities in the United States, and they celebrate one Eucharist in the midst of this divided political reality. So this is actually a girl extending her hand at the sign of peace during that liturgy. I don't actually know which side of the border she's on, and it's really probably better that we don't know. But to me, this exemplifies this issue. So the heart of this talk really, here's the core message of this. While the dominant political narrative is about othering the migrant, and it moves us from our unity, our oneness, to otherness, the dominant Eucharistic narrative is about moving us from our otherness, our fragmentedness, to our unity, our oneness in Christ. So this is really where the journey of migration hits a theological core. So I'm a theologian. People often ask me, what do you think about policy? What do you think about this? These are all important issues, and some of you are very much deep in the weeds on this. But I'm offering reflections from my own experience, from my research, but also from my perspective as a theologian. And hopefully that'll shape the imagination. And that's ultimately, I think, what I want to contribute in the talk today with just these simple reflections. But I'd like to start as well with a news conference that happened in the year 2000. At that time, Francis Collins, one of the lead scientists of the Human Genome Project, had announced that they had deciphered the human DNA and that they had come up with a map of the human genome. And it was at that point that this launched a whole set of other research projects that really tried to look at the implications of trying to understand the sequencing of the human genome. But one of them more particularly for our work was that they began mapping out different genetic patterns of indigenous tribes throughout the world. What that meant was that from a simple sample from your cheek, you could actually trace back your migration heritage and your migration path over the last 80,000 years. So as I did a sampling with this and my relatives, this actually is the migration history of my relatives over the last 80,000 years. Is that we began actually not far from Masaje, from where you come from, in the Olduvai Gorge. This is probably where humanity began. And my ancestors over the last 80,000 years passed through this route until they came up to really southern Spain, Italy, and England. And it was from there, this is the deep migration, and it was from there that they would have crossed over more recently from Ireland, from England to Ireland, and then from Ireland, in this case, to the United States. So migration is literally in our genes. So all this stuff about Trump and the politics, this is just nothing that is a blip on the radar screen. This has been going on since really the beginning of time. Migration is a part of our genes. It's part of our biological genes, but it's also part of our spiritual genes as well. And as we look at this, this is obviously the ancient Near East, or more in our contemporary boundaries. These are the countries that map out today, but it's also something of refugee central. I mean, this is really where a lot of refugees are fleeing: Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and many of these places, coming in also from Afghanistan, and more recently from Ukraine. So migration's in our political histories as well. It's also in our national identities. But all this comes together in a place like Lampedusa, where Pope Francis had heard the story shortly after he'd been elected about a group of refugees that were crossing over from the African coast. And I'll go into more detail in a moment. But he was so compelled by the indifference to the migrants and the refugees in this moment that he, within 8 days, he actually flew down to this island. It was his first pastoral visit outside the United States. And he actually used the chalice made from the driftwood of a refugee boat. So this is actually the Mass in Lampedusa. And you can see it's celebrated on top of a small boat. But it really begs the question, and maybe the question to reflect on today: what does it mean to celebrate the Mass in the context of the global refugee crisis? Or in other words, what's the connection between what's happening inside churches with what's happening outside churches? Migration's at the core of both of those. So this is what I really want to reflect on today. And in a nutshell, I'd really like to cover just a few main points. The first is the global refugee crisis, which I would describe as the voyage of the nobodies, really how people would see them today. Secondly, the globalization of indifference, which is about their struggle to become somebody. The third point is about the globalization of solidarity, which is about their connection to everybody. And the central point is really trying to look at this relationship between the body of refugees and the body of Christ. How do we look at the correlation between those two? Many of you are well-versed in the data, the experience of refugees today, both in the narratives and in the numbers. But just as a review, as we know, there are more migrants than at any other point, international migrants than any other point in history. There are currently about 281 million international migrants around the world. So these are people who are living outside of their country from their homeland, from where they were born. That means about 1 out of every 28 people, or sometimes the numbers go as high as 1 out of every 35 people in the world is a migrant. And there are more than 100 million refugees. This is more than at any point, even since World War II. These numbers continue to go up dramatically. Any of us who've been working in this field have seen this go from 40 to 60 to 80, but now 100 million people are considered refugees around the world. It's rather staggering. Another way of looking at this is that if refugees were settled in one particular place, they'd be the 21st largest country in the world. And they'd be growing at 38,000 people a day, or 24 people per minute. And if you were to count internal migrants, that is those people circulating within a country, there could be counted as many as 1 billion migrants, which is 1 out of every 7 people in the world. So it's aptly named Our Own Times, the Age of Migration. And this is affecting every area of society and of modern life. So if we don't deal with these issues directly, they're certainly going to deal with us. But behind these numbers are human faces. I didn't get into this because of just an academic interest. I got into this because I knew people who were migrants. I worked in parishes and along the border of people who had touched my lives. And as I began to hear their stories, I began to wonder what's the connection between their stories and these stories that we read in the scriptures. And, you know, I'm sure each of us would have stories of migrants who've touched our lives. And in a series of visits and delegations with the Bishops' Conference, I remember this particular story was we were looking at the Syrian refugee crisis. This is probably now 10 or 11 years ago. But I remember this woman with her head in her hands had already lost 3 sons during the war. These women there, There's just a sea of kids that were just in this plastic tarp and in this tent. And they were now widows. And she had just received word that her fourth son was put in prison, and her nephew was actually was killed. And you could see this woman sitting on this pile of wood in the middle of this field, suddenly realizing the devastation of her life. And at that moment, I realized that I did in two moments that the Pietà moved me to tears. One was when I saw it carved of stone in Rome, and the second when I saw the Pietà carved out a living experience in the life of the refugees here. And so these are real stories, real people. These are not just numbers or statistics. And a big part of a theology of migration is trying to put the human face to the migrant and tell these stories. The real power of the theology of migration is hearing these stories and letting them move us. And what Pope Francis was really pointing out when he went to Lampedusa was if these stories fail to touch us, then there's something of which our own soul has been deported to a foreign land. So in all of this, migration is happening around the world. And this is just a sampling of some of the routes that migrants are traveling today. We're probably most familiar, obviously, with those coming from South America, but we know in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as different parts of Asia, most recently in Ukraine, people are on the move. And they're trying to go to places of safety, places where they are protected. Ironically, sometimes they're even breaking the law because the law in their own country doesn't protect them, especially when the cartels and other gangs have really taken hold of society and are forcing people to move. And they're often not moving voluntarily. They're actually moving because they have to. They're actually fleeing these countries. They're not just deciding to leave these countries. But we know this is a dangerous journey. And as receiving countries feel the push of more numbers, although many in this room could also state that the burden sharing is actually more done by poorer countries than by wealthier countries. But as we put bigger barriers at our borders, the routes become more dangerous for people to migrate. So as we look at these numbers, there's a missing migrant project that has begun recording the number of deaths since 2014. Now, keep in mind, these are only the documented deaths. These are only the confirmed deaths. But in many ways, these numbers are actually much higher than the numbers that we have. So those that have been down at the border, Don Kerwin had done a very early report about deaths at the border when he was directing clinic. And I think was really one of the early ones to sort of signal that, hey, there's a lot of people who are dying across the border as they're beginning to militarize it. So this has been increasing around the world as these fences have been put up around Europe and, if you will, in the United States. But my focus today is to really look at the migration and Mediterranean routes. And here you can see a map. See in the center of the map there, you can see these orange lines that are really coming out of North Africa. So during the Arab Spring, 2013, a lot of political instability, a lot of human rights violations, a lot of persecution, and people were fleeing this. Also, Gaddafi had thought that he would, one of the ways he weaponized migrants or used them as weapons was to try to flood Europe with all these refugees to try to collapse some of the infrastructure in Europe. So this is an example of one of the boats that actually was crossing over. You can see they pack as many as 700 to 800 people into these boats. They put them on these rickety vessels and they just send them northwards. And in 2013, there was a number of that was coming across the open seas, and the boat capsized, as many of them do. And when it capsized, only 8 people survived. And they survived by clinging to a fishing net in the middle of the ocean. But when the fishermen saw these refugees clinging to this net, instead of actually rescuing them, they severed their nets and they cast them to die into the ocean depths. And Pope Francis was newly elected. He'd been elected in March. This was actually late June. And he was so moved by this indifference to these refugees that he made it one of the signature parts of his papacy to really speak about this indifference to those who were considered nobodies. And what he did within 8 days, even amidst some hesitation from his advisors, he decided to go down to the small island of Lampedusa. Now, Lampedusa is no more than a rock in the middle of the Mediterranean. It's only 8 square miles in area, but it's sometimes called the door of Europe. And there was when the village, you can imagine this village of a couple hundred people gets news that, by the way, this week the Pope is coming to visit. They had to marshal very quickly and to figure out, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And it turns out that they decided that they were going to have a mass. And so the question was, well, how are we going to celebrate mass in this context with all the things we're dealing with? A lot of bodies were washing up upon the shore from these refugees, you know, day after day, week after week, year after year. As the crisis worsened, people on the village literally were rescuing bodies. In fact, person who I'll introduce you to here in a moment, I'm actually going to come back to this boat here on the right, if you just keep your eyes on that one, but I want to introduce you to a person named Franco Tuzio. He's a carpenter to the village, and he was tasked with preparing for the liturgy. And what would happen is each day he would go down to the shore, and there would be bodies that would be washing up upon the shore. And at one point it occurred to him that he was taking these bodies out of the water. Nobody actually knew that these people were even dying. But at the same time, in those same days, as he was actually rescuing migrants, he'd heard a story that there was an earthquake in Italy, the L'Aquila earthquake. And at that point, there were 318 people, I believe, who had died in the earthquake. And it was occasion for a national day of mourning. The shutters were closed, the airports had shut down, schools weren't open, and people had a moment of silence to remember the 318 people who had died. At the same time, there were 325 people who had died on a boat during those same days, but nobody ever even noticed them. They were literally nobodies. They were nobody to anybody, which is really one of the deepest fears in my conversations with migrants, is that, you know, the biggest fear is that you're just nobody. And so Franco was really disturbed. He says there are kind of like first-class deaths, like those who died in the earthquake, and there's like those who just die and no one even notices. And that bothered him. So he wanted to say, he said he was depressed because he would just go around and kind of wonder, you know, what do I do about this? And what does it mean? Like, even when I myself try to live out my faith, what's its connection to these people who I'm pulling out of the water? So what he decided to do was, sometime later, there was this boat that I just showed you earlier, and it was a group that was coming over from North Africa again, and as they were getting towards the area of Lampedusa, the Coast Guard intercepted them and tried, and basically started escorting them towards Lampedusa harbor. But as they were escorting them, the rudder broke, and they were perilously drifting towards the rocky coast of Lampedusa. So in the middle of the night, they summoned the village. People came out, and they, at great risk to themselves and in the rocky waters, they actually were able to commandeer the boat and safely bring it to shore and to get people off of the boat. And so they managed to bring 300 some people off that boat, including women and children. And this boat became literally a symbol of salvation. It became a symbol of salvation because they saved so many people that day. And in contrast to all the people they had brought out of the water, this was one where they're like, wow, we finally have saved some. And so was the case until some days later, after they brought the boat in, it crashed against the rocks, and it kind of became basically a bunch of driftwood and pieces. And as they were taking out the hull, they found 3 bodies. So what had become a symbol of salvation also was a symbol of death. So this wood told the story. And what Franco did eventually was he after this boat broke out and they actually buried these 3 refugees, if you will, in this Arimathean grave. Someone had really given them this place to bury them. He decided to do something else with his hands because he was, again, so depressed and he could start working around. But he said, I need to make something that brings out the memory of those who have died. So he tried to rescue them from their disturbing anonymity. And what he did is he took the driftwood of this refugee boat and he started making some crosses. And then these began to make their way around Europe. These crosses began to symbolize something of the migrants who had died. But then when the time came for this liturgy, he wanted to go one step further. Interestingly enough, when they were working with the Vatican about the Pope's visit, they actually offered the Pope a chance to choose out of the 4 chalices that they said we could use at the liturgy. And interestingly enough, he chose to use a chalice that he had made from the driftwood of a refugee boat. So you can see on the left there of Franco, just a big piece of driftwood that's really kind of from the refugee boat. But from that, he decided to carve out this chalice. And he made the ferula here of the Pope used. If you can see, there's a fish there, and then there's a loaf of bread, there's a heart in the middle. But he made this also out of the driftwood of a refugee boat. And he made the ambo out of the rudders out of a refugee boat. And again, here the Pope was beginning to steer the church, if you will, in a new direction. And so there's this very rich imagery kind of emerging from this, from the chief lead apostle, if you will, and the fisherman of the fishers of men and women. But of all of them, this was, I think, one of the most significant, which is was the chalice itself. And this chalice, again, was made from the driftwood of a refugee boat. And he said that as he was carving this, he saw these, when he's doing the stem, he took out this nail because he needed to put it on the lathe. But as he did, he saw these holes in it. And he said the holes were evocative of Christ's own wounds. But he said after he carved it, he put the nail back into it. And he realized that, that the stem made the form of a cross. So it's on top of the cross is the chalice of life. And that's why this became something that when I encountered it, and I went back and forth to this area for a number of years, I began to say my encounter with that chalice said there's something really significant here. And I don't know what it is, but it's something significant. And again, it kept coming back to what's this connection between the body of Christ and the body of these refugees that's held in the stories of this wood. And that's a theological question. So that's really done more at length in the book and in an article called A Cup of Suffering, Chalice of Salvation. But the main point here was to really ask, what is this connection? And while in some sense, the story of the refugees was about the voyage of these nobodies, the reason why they were migrating was just because they desired to become somebody. And often, as we know, refugees and migrants will often say, I just want to become a human being. I just want to become somebody. It's not that I'm just coming to get rich or become more powerful, you know, and sometimes disturbingly migrants have said to me, they said, we'll even be your slaves, but all we want to do is make some money to send back home to our families in need, you know. But I think, but when we see at the heart of this, we see Christ himself was the migrant, And this was something that came up in the research that Jesus himself, God in Jesus, so loved the world that he migrated to the broken and sinful territory of our sinful existence. And there he reconciled himself on the cross so that we can migrate back to our homeland. And as we go more deeply into this, it's interesting because Jesus himself was undocumented, illegal alien. He was undocumented because at the time of his birth, his parents went to Bethlehem during a documentation crisis, right? He was illegal in the sense that his mother had him out of wedlock. You know, when you think about it, like to be betrothed and to be really in this relationship with Joseph at the time of the incarnation, the time of the conception, really raises a lot of questions. Like, why would you use this time, God? I mean, why not use a more palatable time when the Pharisees and the Sadducees could have kind of had a little easier time with this? And yet in this, that in migrating to Mary's womb, if you will, born out of wedlock, born in a documentation crisis, but also born as an alien. So he actually really was from another world. So he actually really was an alien. He was from a different place. And so we ask, like, why would God in Jesus become an undocumented legal alien? Except to open up sort of a pathway to hope for all those who are outside the law, all those who are excluded from table, all those who are nobodies of the world. So in this sense, the Eucharist really remembers that story. And it actually connects that story with the stories of today. And so what's at stake here is a very liminal space of which we not only memorize God's migration to us, it's not only connected to those who are migrating in the world, but it's also connected to our migration through this world. Right? In that sense that we actually ritualize in the procession and recession from church, our own pilgrimage to the altar, which is our own death, symbolizes our own death, and our own sort of being sent out to the world as migrants. So what that means is not about us and them, it's about all of us. And that the incarnation reframes what that othering of the migrants is about by really framing it in terms of us all being on this journey together. So what that all means, I think, or at least what I would offer on some level, is here is the Eucharist at the border again. This is the bishops on the American side connecting with the bishops on the other side, and the community from both sides of the fence coming together to celebrate this one Eucharist. Here you see Bishop Buchanan from Arizona offering communion on the other side of the border to people on the other side. So again, staying with that imagination, this is entering into a Eucharistic imagination. What's at stake here is not more information about migration. What's at stake is a theological imagination, one that sees that at heart we are all migrants, that God himself in Jesus was a migrant, and that in turn should have implications for the way we treat one another. And because in Christ, the walls have already been broken down, the communion is the beginning of the celebration of that union, even when our policies say otherwise. So just to summarize again, what I really wanted to highlight here, one was the global refugee crisis. Secondly, what Pope Francis calls the globalization of indifference to those who are migrating. But thirdly, the globalization of solidarity. This Eucharistic imagination, again, is about always remembering that, you know, those who are journeying today are often considered nobodies in the eyes of society, even though with the eyes of faith, it's a very different vision. They do desire to become somebody and to become human, but in that they're connected to everybody who share a common struggle. And in this, there is a profound and integral relationship to the body of Christ. Now, to bring this to conclusion, we could say that, in other words, we're all in the same boat, if you will, that we're all headed to the same port. But here's something that Laudato Tomasi said to me almost 25 years ago, and I think this is very profound, that while we who work in the church, we work in society, often think it's us that's helping the immigrants, if we see them as really imaging Christ, often in distressing disguise, that's something in the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the sick, the imprisoned, the estranged, which map out very cleanly, if you will, on the migrant experience. That if Christ is present there without our necessarily seeing it, then it's not just that we who save the immigrants. If, as Tomasi said, it's not the church that saves the immigrant, but when we see their capacity to believe in the midst of the unbelievable, to trust in the midst of such hopeless circumstances, and to even love and give their lives in the midst of such painful realities, it's really the immigrant who saves the church. So I want to thank Laudato Tomasi for that vision, all the Scalabrinians who've been continuing to carry on that tradition, and all of you who continue this mission. So, and also want to point out Luisa Bartolo Zavala, who's working in Monterrey, Mexico right now, running a migrant shelter. And all of you I know working in this area or in this ministry. So we're involved with this. And so hopefully some of these words just give some added sort of salsa to our continued work on their behalf. So thank you very much.
Father Cody, and I'm not sure how I'm going to present a response to this, but bear with me because you'll understand the context of his presentation as I share with you. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude for the initiative of a theology of migration, Father. It's long overdue. My response to this initiative is more an affirmation of the efforts that the father is doing. I'm an immigrant in a lifelong process of integration. This country has afforded me and my family tremendous opportunities, which I cannot find elsewhere. Yet, I'm constantly reminded that I'm an outsider. I have learned to anticipate people's questions, reading their body language. Where are you from? Where is your accent from? When did you come here? Why did you come here? Some are innocent and curious questions as a teaching moment. I have also encountered xenophobia, including neo-Nazi sticker put on my store windows, which read, if you want to fight crime, deport the N-word. If you are a person of color in the US, it's guaranteed that you'll be othered regardless of your legal status or place of birth. The legacy of othering people of a non-European descent is the sin of America, which we are not able to shake it off easily. Recent immigrants and refugees become easy targets. Migration is also as old as a human being on the face of the earth. As an African, I can confirm that you all carry my African DNA, regardless of the shade of your color, of your skin, the texture of your hair, the color of your eyes. You are my brothers and sisters. Aside from our common divine origin, physically, we are brothers and sisters from the same mother, Africa. Every ethnic group or tribe claims to have originated somewhere else from their current habitat or place of residence. For example, ancient Egyptians believed that their ancestors migrated from the hinterland of Africa, following the flow of the Nile River. We all know the story of Abraham, our ancestor of faith, migrated from current-day Iraq, Palestine, Egypt, and back to Palestine. Our Judeo-Christian values inform us that every human person created in the image and likeness of God should be treated with respect and dignity, regardless where they are. As Father Goody's analysis, the Imago Dei is on target, but in the US historical context, some people claim to be better images of God than others. American exceptionalism and the manifest destiny managed to create God in the American image, giving birth to racism based on the shade of one's skin. Yes, racism, American original sin. Yet, God was never silent. God continued to pique the conscience of America, saying, where is your brother? Even the response continues to be, am I my brother's keeper? In our Catholic tradition, we confess to the sins we committed by commission or omission. At welcoming a stranger is a sin of omission. The last judgment, Jesus will tell us, I am the brother or sister you neglected. Therefore, we cannot abdicate our responsibilities of our brothers and sisters keepers, especially those on the margins. God always is the initiator who makes the first move to meet us where we are by being one of us, shining his light in our darkness. In the Israelite Christian tradition where I come from, there is a Eucharistic prayer for Our Lady, and it says, God looked down from heaven, look to the east, look to the west, look to the north, and look to the south. But he could not find none like you. He admired your beauty and loved your essence and sent his loved Son unto you. The same Eucharistic prayer also reminds the reason the Son of God was incarnate to save us from all our human folly. The theology of migration, as Father Grody presents, is the push factor that creates refugee crisis emanating from psychopath dictators, the likes of King Herod, alarmed that a little baby was born to be one day a king. This part of Eucharistic prayer reads, I read it in my language. أذكري أودنجل هابم مذكر زي إرسع أذكري للدوتو من نيك زتولد ببتليهم وتتقبل لي بأسرقت وأستمع موقوة باستنفاس أدق ولحم بمواعل قر أذكر إنك دوتو مثلك إن زي قوي مثله إمهاجر واستهاجر بمواعل هيرود سنوغوس. The translation is, O Virgin, remembering one, never to forget. Remind him about his birth from you on a cold night when you wrapped him in swaddling clothes, receiving warmth from the breast of animals. Remind him about his migration with you, wandering from country to country, seeking refuge during King Herod's reign. Remind him the tears flowing from your eyes, washing your beloved son's cheeks. Remind him the hunger, thirst, and all the difficulties you endured together. Remind him of mercy, not of condemnation. Remind him he came for sinners, not the righteous. He came to cleanse the defiled, not the pure ones. Theology of migration touches the historical context of racism, which embedded in our structures and institutions still operative. Special people of color. Such lingering legacy is not even conscious. It is in autopilot manifested in the form of entitlement us versus them. The treatment of refugees and immigrants is simply an extension of the historical legacy of racism. Eurocentrism as the yardstick by which every other culture is valued and measured distorts the creative image of God in each other. The church was willing to participate in the sin of racism by commission or omission. The excuse was to obey the law of the land, which Reverend Martin Luther King calls the unjust laws. Yet, the church was not without prophets from within and from without, challenging her to do the right thing. The cry of the suffering, the marginalized, and the poor never is left unheeded before God's eyes. Jesus gives us the examples of Lazarus, who waited day and night at the gate of the doorsteps of the rich man. Lazarus would be comforted by dogs while his fellow person indulged in luxurious and lavish lifestyle. Lazarus was nobody to the rich man. Nobodies of Laudato Si were my fellow Eritreans, and is personal to me. I'm very grateful to Father, to you, highlighting this tragedy, because more than 90% of those perished on that fateful night are my fellow Eritreans. I knew the parents of some who perished, especially one young man was the son of my grade school classmate. Additionally, on June 2014, two sons of my cousins, each of them lost their firstborn in Libya without a trace, no closure to where their whereabouts, until the Syrian civil war erupted. 40% of those who were crossing the Mediterranean Sea came from Eritrea, my country of origin. It was not economic lure that became irresistible as a pull factor for Eritrean youth to take such dangerous journey to the Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean Sea to Europe. It was the unbearable push factor that made them leave their country at any cost, embarking on the dangerous crossing to the neighboring countries. The Eritrean Catholic Church serves as the prophetic voice to the people of Eritrea who became the nobodies of the world. The pastoral letter of the Eritrean Catholic bishops include, "Where is your brother?" Easter 2014. And Peace and Reconciliation, Pentecost Sunday 2019. The pastoral letters were widely accepted by all Eritrean people across religious traditions, including Muslims. They gave them a ray of hope that troubles don't last always. The Eritrean government retaliated against the Catholic Church by confiscating clinics, hospitals, schools, including technical schools. And this morning, I just read on the news, the Salesian Technical School of the Kamhare was confiscated this week. September 4, 2022, the Eritrean military raided my home church, my parish, during Sunday Mass, taking all the youth, boys and girls, including choir members and altar servers, disturbing the Eucharistic liturgy. During the same week, 2 of my cousins and my brother-in-law in their 50s and their 60s has been taken to the military. Therefore, the push factors that lead into desperate flee of the Eritrean youth, emptying the future of a nation, the only country in the development world with negative birth rate. This is a classic case of political refuge. Even those considered economic refugees are victims of multinational greed, ecological devastation, mineral and oil extractions to satisfy the consumer appetite of the Northern Hemisphere. Despotic regimes are aided and abated and tolerated for national interests, leaving behind failed state, breeding extremism, and opening the floodgates of refugees and immigrants. The liberation theologians of the Latin America served as prophetic voice for the voiceless, but it seems to have fallen out of fashion. The civil rights movement in the US served as the conscience of the world society, but that one is also considered radical and incompatible to the church's teaching. I'm afraid we continue to persecute and kill the prophets, which Jesus lamented and labeled on Jerusalem. James Cone, the father of Black liberation theology, wrote "The Cross and the Lynching Tree," linking the suffering of African American to the mob justice of lynching to that of suffering of Christ on the cross. The Laudato Si carpenter has made a connection, carving out of the shipwreck wood a Eucharistic table and sacrificial altar for France to celebrate as a memorial mass for the victims of Laudato Si. Analogous to the cross and the humiliating menace of torture, the lynching victims and those who perished in the high seas are just as signs and symbol for us to see and make internal journey of conversion as our brothers and sisters keepers. God's redemptive intervention continues to be a reality even in the midst of such ugliness and human tragedy. In the African American expression, God makes a way out of no way. It is in this context that refugees and immigrants are resilient because they focus on the vision, Visio Dei, as Father expresses it, where people of all race and language aspire to gather. They are the true believers of the beloved community and the American dream, and this country offers that hope. In spite of its weakness and shortcoming, the US symbolizes where everyone from around the world realizes his or her potential. we have to also be aware as countries lose to the brain drain, US is guilty of brain wastes. Most of the skills of foreign-born and minority professionals are underutilized. Equity and inclusion are not dirty words, they are challenges that each person has God-given right to participate in the creative work of God, making the world better than he or she was born into. This due to structural racism and selfish policies developed to minimize the competition of high-paying professional jobs. Recently, a former refugee of Asian origin shared with me that she worked hard with her family to raise her children, but her children, though educated and accomplished, are still facing the same otherness and racism. And that is the reality we are. Yet, we hope that this type of dialogue will move us to the next level. Thank you.
So Father Grudy probably doesn't remember this, but I was a Notre Dame undergrad when he was a Holy Cross seminarian at Moreau Seminary. And I lived in Sorin College, and one of the great things about living there was you got to play monk hoops. So the first time that we actually met, we were both in shorts and t-shirts over in the gym of Moreau Seminary playing the famous monk hoops. And just to add, since that time, Monk has always been very favorable to your work. And he's always lifted you up as a Holy Cross seminarian and later priest and later theologian who really honors your order. So I really appreciate the chance to hopefully give some of that honor back. In typical Jesuit fashion, I'm going to commend and then recommend a few things with your talk. I was told ahead of time that your presentation was going to be based on your 2017 article titled "The Cup of Suffering" from Theological Studies, which you might have noticed on our second floor, we have a big stack of, so I was able to grab that and take a look. I want to start maybe with looking at some of the theological impulses behind your presentation today, and then maybe push you towards a couple more. So one of the things that Father Grudy does in that 2017 article is set up what it means to be a nobody. And yesterday in my doctoral seminar on Latin American theology, we were reading The Theology of Liberation by Gustavo Gutierrez, who we both know and have grown to love through his work throughout the world, but as chair of, has a chair in theology at Notre Dame. As Gustavo Gutierrez puts it, the poor are people who are not considered and not respected as persons. They are, in fact, non-persons. One may be a non-person or be insignificant for economic, cultural, political, gender, and racial reasons. Hence, we must be careful to understand that the economic dimension is not the only one that must be taken into consideration when dealing with poverty. The same holds true for migrants. I think one of the things that Father Grudy has done today is to help us realize that the poor, migrants, etc., we need to think about their status as non-persons. And one of the great things with the images that you've shown us today is it allows us to see these migrants as people. The second commendation, and this also comes from your work in trying to rescue some of the historical Jesus project here and to think about who Jesus was. John Meyer observes that we cannot separate our Christian faith from who Jesus was. And your use of the Eucharist reminds us that that originally was a table. It was a gathering for friends. It was people who were gathered together and in a sense of remembrance. But interesting, Jesus had a lot of meals. and with a lot of people who were on the margins. And Meyer points out that it's those on the margins, those who were outcasts, those who were unclean, those who were considered to be despicable by society. In some ways, your rescuing of the Eucharist is similar to the parable of the prodigal son that Meyer mentions. We are welcoming back to the table all of those people who are on the margins, those that society might consider non-persons. As Meyer says, Jesus reached out to the outcasts of society. And then finally, when I was reading, I actually put the stress on the wrong syllable. So when I read no bodies, as you say, I thought of it as literally the disembodied, those that don't have bodies. But I think what your talk does today is to remind us that the migrants are embodied. These are people. They are not nobody. And what you said in 2017 in this, again, Eucharistic space, the Eucharist allows us to remember those who are forgotten, those who are the nobodies of our society. And I think, and I'm going to push you towards this later, that's also where we might be able to find our hope, that there is a kind of eschatological mercy which is received in the Eucharist when we are all together, and to think of how we welcome everyone, migrants, non-persons, etc., to that Eucharistic table. I'm going to skip over, for sake of time, your use of Metz, etc., but I think that's also Elizondo and Metz are important interlocutors here for you. I want to just shift to this idea of the boat. And I think it's a wonderful image. It's a journey. We know that Jesus took a journey. We know that Jesus had a road to Jerusalem. We know that this boat, when you're on a boat coming from Minnesota, everyone knows it can be a little bit dangerous when the waves come up, especially in stormy weather. But there's also a safety in numbers. And when you have this boat of all these people, there is a sense that they were on a journey together. I think the difficulty for me, and the second part of the image that we didn't see, is also the image of those migrants who died. And here I want to push you a little bit towards the sense of who are these bodies? Because after Lampedusa, I was in El Salvador, and I was in the Jesuit community, and Sobrino and others were there. And one of the fathers remarked about the caras in the boat. And the exact phrase, which I'll always remember, is, miran las caras en este barco. Look at the faces. And I think maybe that sense of cara, I think it was also a root for caritas or charity or mercy, I think it helps us, especially in the global north, to look at their faces. Because when we see the faces of those who are in the boat, it's really hard to not see them as persons or to see them as nobodies. And finally, if we had to do a theological throwdown here, I would probably throw in some Ea Korea and Sobrino, this idea of the crucified peoples. And as you mentioned with the cross, in the migrant, we can see an identification with cross. We see a people who are literally crucified, day in and day out. But I'll end with the last theological notion, and that is of Ea Korea's haciéndose cargo de la realidad, to take charge of reality. And I think that's twofold here with the migrant. Part of taking charge of reality is seeing the boat, seeing the non-person, seeing those faces, and to make a claim that in fact that is wrong. They are in fact people. They are in fact persons. They do in fact have human dignity, and that they are worth our time and certainly should be at our Eucharistic banquet. But I think it also can give us a vision for hope, because when we recognize these migrants, when we recognize these non-persons, it also hopefully enriches us. And I'll just leave with this notion. Dr. Bostic mentioned that my new role here has to do with student success. And we know that on campus here, we have some students who are undocumented. If we look at their faces, if we realize they're part of our boat here at Marquette, it also allows us to realize that they are a gift and that they bring something to our community, which is not only valuable, not only important, but is part of this Eucharistic banquet and hopeful sense of the mercy of God. Thank you.
Okay, so we have about 2 minutes for Q&A left. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand and I can bring the mic to you.
Thank you. I can't, asking our lecturer, say a few words to develop the theme of the bodies of the migrants being the body of Christ, because having spent some time at Notre Dame myself, I know that that body of Christ stuff can get pretty mystical. And so I'm curious as to how your book, if it does, develops that theme deeper than your references in the lecture just now, please.
The approach that I use is a narrative approach, and I actually take the rite of the Eucharist in its introductory rite, the liturgy of the word, the homily, the liturgy of the Eucharist, and the communion rite as a basically heuristic device to basically reframe the narrative. So again, looking at the big picture of moving from otherness to oneness, and how the Eucharist is moving us in that direction, and that narrative helps us. I literally take the introductory rite as looking at the global age of migration. And then I look at the liturgy of the word. And so I look at what parallels in the liturgy, an Old Testament reading, a Psalm, a New Testament reading, and the gospel. And in that, I actually look at how the scriptures speak about migration. I look at the migrants in the Bible and its correlation with migrants today and their stories. I also look at the journey of a Syrian refugee in particular, who actually worked with me as a grad student. I met him at the Syrian border, and it's a story of his being tortured under Assad, and how he used the Psalms to really give expression to basically the inner landscape of the soul. So because the Psalms are written in the same territory of Syria where he lived, to see how they give a universal expression of migrants who are displaced in a foreign land. In the homily, I actually look at, I did a journey in England with a group of refugees on what was called refugee tales. So we actually walked the path of Chaucer, of the Canterbury Tales. And as Chaucer was forging the English language at 700-800 years ago when he wrote those tales, so the purpose of refugee tales was to form a new language around migrants and refugees in a more humanizing tone, working with refugees from those areas. So I work with a refugee who was on that journey with us to really bring out the human face of the migrant, as John was saying, and the face of Christ in the migrant. The liturgy of the Eucharist gets into the story of Lampedusa, but also crossing over the divides that we create linguistically, that really looks how the table, the kingdom, really are at the heart of understanding who we are in this world, who God was for us, and who the journey of the migrants today. The communion rite takes the Matthew 25 and the works of mercy, and looks at how these works of mercy are embodied in different organizations around, especially the country and the world, that are feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, burying the dead, and so on. So all of that is a way of saying that the Eucharistic narrative hopefully will challenge and disrupt operative narratives that dehumanize, exclude, and reject in favor of kind of more life-giving narratives, I think, that are held out for us. So in the end, it's a theology of communion.
Dan, since we don't have much time left, would you like to just give your response to the respondents to wrap up?
First, I honor just the authority of those who've lived this experience and those who are like Fasaya, whose stories are deeply personal and connected to people from Eritrea, and who really have the authority of speaking on this issue because they've lived through it. Even if I can understand pieces of that experience, those who've actually been closest to those who've done, I think often have the most perspective on whether or not these perspectives that we share actually helps illuminate that or not. And I've often looked to the ground floor, not just to other academics, to really help us understand whether or not these theologies have any validity or traction. So I honor those stories. They're very important in terms of really clarifying these stories theologically. And I think John's perspective as well. This is the Feast of the Triumphs of the Cross. This is a great time to actually reflect on this topic because I think Ignacio Correa, John Sobrino, these are names that are very fresh in my mind this morning when we went to Mass. But I think those are also figures that have had a big impact on my life. But also how those who are crucified today are not just subject who are petitioning for our charity. They're also protagonists in the salvation of the world. And I think that's, to me, where the transformation and this eschatological reversal could come in, is that they have something very important to give, but I'll say they are, in ways we don't always see, are integral to saving the world.
Okay. Okay, sorry folks online. I just learned that I needed a microphone, so now I have one. So we'll take it from the top. Thanks everyone for joining us today in this breakout session where we're going to share what our Catholic ministries who serve immigrants have learned during COVID-19 from their experience. I'm pleased to be with you here today. The Catholic Health Association has been an active partner with the Catholic Immigrant Integration Initiative from the beginning, and we're really proud to be a part of this and excited to be able to contribute. I want to start by telling you a little bit about the Catholic Health Association in case you don't know who we are. We're a membership organization. We represent 650 hospitals and 1,600 long-term care and other healthcare facilities across the country in all 50 states. Approximately 1 in 7 patients in the hospital are in a Catholic hospital. So we serve a large percentage of the people in this country. Our members also serve immigrant communities in their areas. They serve them in many ways, obviously through the healthcare that they provide and the services, but also many of our members employ dreamers and are working for immigration reform, which immigration reform and services for immigrants are important priorities for Catholic Health Association in our federal advocacy work that we do with Congress and the administration. And we're also active partners in the Justice for Immigrants campaign that the U.S. bishops run. I want to tell you a little something else about the Catholic Health Association that's a really important part of our work right now, and that is our We Are Called initiative. In the early months of the pandemic, we, as everybody else, recognized the disparate impact that the COVID-19 pandemic was having on certain communities, including our immigrant communities. We also saw the terrible murders and police interactions that happened during that summer with George Floyd and others. And so in July, our CIII board came together and decided we needed to work as a united Catholic health ministry to address racism and to become leaders, be a leading voice in this area. Many of our members were already involved in this kind of work, but we wanted to come together and really work for change. And as they talked amongst themselves and they said, well, what can we do about racism? We're healthcare providers. So what they launched was our Confronting Racism by Achieving Health Equity pledge. Over 90% of CII's members have signed this pledge, which has 4 elements. First, it was a pledge, remember, this was July of 2020, a pledge for immediate action, taking immediate action to ensure equity in COVID-19 testing, treatment, and then eventually vaccination. The second pledge pillar calls for us to get our own houses in order. So that means looking internally at our HR practices, at our contracting practices, how we gather demographic data, how we use it to identify quality disparities that might be occurring within the 4 walls of the hospital, and then to take action. Our third pillar is building trusting relationships in our communities. Really being intentional and recommitting to going into our communities and partnering with people and communities on an equal basis, not doing for them, not assuming what they need, not maybe talking to them, but then going ahead and doing what you want, but really integrate community representatives and the community voice into the operation of the hospital so that we can work together to solve the problems in the community. And then the final pillar is our advocacy pillar, where we at CIII work federally and our members work federally, but also on the state and local level to advocate for policies that will, I'm going to make up a word, disembed racism from existing systems, and then take steps to address racially disparate impacts and health disparities and advance health inequity. So I wanted to go through those partly because of our commitment to COVID-19 health equity. And since that's our topic today, is what we've learned about serving immigrants during COVID-19. The pandemic obviously brought with it monumental change. It's kind of hard to think about what the world was like 2 years ago. And how different it is now. In that first year alone, our hospitals faced an onslaught of seriously ill patients and far too many deaths. It became very difficult to get care for other health needs because of the fear of transmission of the virus, because of shortages of caregivers. And then immigrant communities had additional challenges, language barriers, fear of potential immigrant consequences, and lack of insurance. Healthcare went virtual, but not for those who didn't have access to computers or the internet. Work went virtual too, for many, but it wasn't an option for those who provide essential services, the things that we rely on day to day throughout the pandemic: healthcare, elder care, food services, delivery, manufacturing, agriculture. In all these sectors, our immigrant communities are overrepresented, and so put themselves on the line and at risk for COVID exposure every day. Throughout that, our hospitals and many other Catholic community organizations stepped up and kept on serving people in need, including immigrants, throughout the pandemic. Today, we're going to hear from 4 panelists about how the pandemic changed how we understand the needs of immigrants, how they operated to serve immigrants and others, and then the lessons learned about serving immigrants that we can take into the future. Our 4 panelists are Jacqueline Pavillon, PhD, here on the podium with me. She is the Deputy Director for the Center for Migration Studies. She's a labor economist, and her research focuses on migration, forced displacement, and immigration policy. She's also worked at the World Bank. She's been in Kenya with Georgetown University, and she's done just lots of really interesting things. Coming with us virtually are Marguerite Peg Harmon. Peg is the CEO of Catholic Community Services of Southern Arizona and the Diocese of Tucson. She's been with them for 40 years, so she has seen a lot. She's seen a lot of change, I'm sure, and particularly a lot of change in the last 2 years. Peg is also a former board chair of Catholic Charities USA. We have Dr. Amy McGahey. She joins us from Creighton University School of Medicine in Omaha, where she is a professor, chair of the Department of Family and Community Medicine, and director for the Interprofessional Clinical Learning Environment, working with medical students. She also provides care at the CIII Health Clinic. CIII stands for Catholic Health Initiatives, which is a part of Common Spirit Health. And then we have also with Amy Cole Mazurek, MBA. He is a market director and oversees the operations of the CIII Health Clinic in Omaha. So first, we're going to hear from each of them, and then after that, we will have time for questions from the folks here in the room and the folks online. And I'd also not only like to hear questions if we have time, but you all are working in ministries that serve immigrants across the country, and we'd love to hear from you what your experience was and what you've learned. So I think we agreed we'd start with Jacqueline, and she is going to share with us what she's learned from her research around health determinants, COVID-19, and immigrants during the pandemic.
Thanks so much, Kathy. It's really a joy to be with all of you. Thank you so much for coming to be part of this massive event, and it's really inspiring to see all the work you're doing as well. So we'd love to hear from you guys as well. In my research over the past few years, before I was working at the bank doing research on the impacts of COVID-19 in primarily the Mediterranean region, kind of the region, that was being discussed in the Tomasi lecture this morning, was more my region of focus. And later at CMS, we did a lot of research on the impact of COVID-19 really in New York City. So I'm kind of going to try and talk about some of the macro impacts and also some of the really micro impacts that we found from our survey research. So I guess one of the lessons we learned from COVID-19 is that, migration is, we know it's driven by different gaps, right? Gaps in age, in the sense that you have a younger population in sending countries that are going to aging countries with aging populations to fill labor shortages. It's driven by wage gaps where people are seeking higher wages in other countries. It's driven by institutional capacity gaps and where people are seeking protection or fleeing from corruption or persecution, right? So, and all of those driving factors, right, they didn't stop just because there was a pandemic. In the same way that, they're saying people were not seeking care for other ailments because of the pandemic. It's not like those other ailments stopped, right? And these driving factors driving migration, they didn't actually halt. And while we did see a dip in migration in the second and third quarter following the lockdown in 2020, migration really did pick back up pretty quickly and reach pre-pandemic levels into 2021. Globally, right? And even came back with more of a force because there was sort of a built up demand to migrate. Those fleeing factors, those reasons for fleeing, those reasons for migrating don't exactly halt in the face of a crisis. And so when you have policies like, Title 42, things that are blocking migration because of a crisis that aren't exactly very flexible, they're not really taking into account the fact that the factors driving migration don't really stop, right? And so what we then saw is when you had these legal avenues kind of closing, is that there was an increased reliance on informal networks for migration globally. There was an increased reliance on smugglers, which led to an increased demand and an increased cost for smuggling networks as ports and land borders were closed and other legal channels were closed. There was an increase in human trafficking. Worldwide, people were taking more dangerous routes to reach their destinations out of desperation. And when they did arrive, and people within migrant networks, either people on the move or immigrants in their destination, were disproportionately hit by the pandemic. We know this across the board in health risks, and not because of anything inherently to do with immigrants themselves. In fact, we know from past research that immigrants are generally healthier than native-born populations. They're generally a younger, more able-bodied population. They're often going for employment purposes. So kind of created this healthy immigrant paradox. Why do you see a generally healthier population harder hit by a health crisis? Well, we know that's because of the social determinants of health surrounding their living conditions, right? They're generally living in disadvantaged households, overcrowded households, not generally in overcrowded households, but more so relative to a native-born population. People are more likely to be taking public transit. We have seen that, and that's obviously related to COVID-19. There's overcrowding in detention centers. So all of these conditions. There's also more occupational risk in the sense that people are more likely to be employed in frontline occupations or essential occupations. A study that CMS did, found that immigrants are more likely to be employed in essential frontline occupations, and even more so undocumented immigrants than the native-born population. And so all of these social conditions are putting people at a higher risk. At the same time, though, you have people excluded either directly or de facto in practical barriers to healthcare or health insurance schemes, right? So there's kind of a double whammy here. At the same time, you have people more disproportionately affected. You have people kind of excluded either due to literal exclusion, such as undocumented immigrants excluded from healthcare schemes, or in regards to practical barriers like language barriers, unfamiliarity with systems, distrust or fear of the systems. In a study that CMS did in January, we found that while immigrants were less distrustful of healthcare systems than other public benefits systems or engagement with law enforcement, for example, there's still a distrust there. And in a study we did in Brooklyn and Queens, in which we surveyed 500 immigrants, we found that 39% of the immigrants we surveyed in these neighborhoods expressed fear of utilizing healthcare services on the basis of race, 28% on the basis of nationality or citizenship, and 12% on the basis of English proficiency, which is that's huge. And of that same survey, 34% said they needed to see a general practitioner in the last year, but didn't, for a variety of reasons. And through that research, we kind of nuanced and we found that the reasons that immigrants were saying they didn't seek healthcare and the reasons that service providers were assuming immigrants were not seeking healthcare were quite different, right? And generally it was from the immigrant side, prohibitive costs, lack of access to health insurance, inability to take time off of work. Whereas, there were some assumptions made about stigma or cultural reasons that people were not seeking healthcare. And so, it really takes research to kind of disentangle why people are not seeking healthcare. Immigrants were also disproportionately hit in regards to education. Kids who don't have as much technology access, or parents who speak the native language at home, or live in overcrowded households that are not as amenable to remote learning. And immigrants were also more economically disproportionately hit in regards to, higher unemployment rates due to the pandemic, or larger food insecurity among refugees, either due to lost employment combined with lack of food aid that was being redirected to COVID-19 purposes. So really across the board, immigrants were really disproportionately hit by this pandemic, as well as, people of color, people who were already in vulnerable situations were disproportionately hit. We know that. And at the same time, an interesting nuance is showing the resiliency of immigrant networks, because an interesting fact is they assumed that remittances would drop way more than they actually did. And so what we did see is that immigrants worldwide, the remittances did drop some, but they not as much as predicted, and they bounced back pretty quickly. And so even in spite of such hardship, migrants were still finding a way to send money back to their families. And in this, economic crisis, it's not only affecting migrants themselves, it's also affecting, receiving communities. And what we see then is we saw, immense labor shortages due to these mobility restrictions, especially in certain industries such as agriculture. Now we see that in supply chain issues, which everybody is talking about, in inflation, and in the study we did in the Mediterranean region in Europe as well, we found that, there is a positive correlation, a direct correlation between how many countries report a shortage in an occupation and the share of workers in that population who are immigrants. So you see that immigrants are really coming to fill jobs that are needed, and that really changes the way we think about immigration. I think that was one of the key takeaways from the pandemic, is it changes the way you think about immigrants filling your labor force in a certain sense. And one of the most reported shortage that is often filled by immigrants in Europe is the nursing profession, especially in healthcare professions. And so, it's kind of a double whammy there, in the sense that you have these mobility restrictions preventing people from reaching jobs that they need to fill. And those are the same jobs that are needed to serve the people who are ill. And so it really changed the way we think about migration, and it changed the way we need to think about migration going forward and how we need to think in a next crisis, whether it be public health related or not, in the short term. And, I think later in the discussion, we'll talk more about how to restructure kind of structural issues within the migration system, but in kind of within a crisis. First of all, you need to be able to restart migration as quickly and safely as possible. We lagged in this crisis about implementing health protocols, and we used it as an excuse to keep certain policies in place that were exclusionary. And so we really need to start migration as quickly as possible, because those forces driving it do not stop. They keep going. And the longer you block it, the more you're not only harming the migrants and themselves, but also the receiving communities and your own economies, really. And secondarily, they have to be more shock responsive by including migrants in social safety nets, in healthcare schemes, health insurance schemes. You need to be able to have adaptable visa policies to fill labor shortages where necessary. You need to have employment retention schemes that allow people to overstay their visas to stay in those jobs, to keep filling them when there are all of these mobility barriers. So you really need to have some sort of flexibility within migration systems. And I think that was a really key lesson we learned during this pandemic, is that they need to be more shock responsive and not have as much lag in their response. So talking about some of the more structural issues in migration systems, how to learn, I'll save for later in the discussion. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. You shared with us a lot of your research that confirmed what I think a lot of us knew or observed anecdotally about the experience of immigrants during COVID, particularly their need for and access to healthcare. So I'd like to turn to Cole and Amy now, coming to us from Omaha, and ask them to share with us how they met the needs of immigrants during COVID and how their practice in their ministries changed. Do we have them?
Yeah, can you hear us okay?
Oh, there you are. Yep.
Perfect. Just wanted to do a sound check, I guess, to make sure that all was well. I'm actually going to, we put together some slides. We thought that might help navigate a little bit of our discussion, since we don't have the pleasure to join those there in the room in person, but we're obviously here as a social or a virtual colleague, excuse me. So I am going to try that real quick and hope that I don't break anything. Okie doke. I think hopefully that worked okay. So real quick again, just my name is Cole Mazurek. I am the director for primary care here with CIII Health, and I have the pleasure to get to work with Dr. McGahey pretty much on a daily basis. And through the pandemic, we both played very key roles within our respective areas that we directly supported. And I actually led operations for our health system, for our division during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially when it was getting started, and had a real unique kind of macro perspective. And so I think as we kind of go through this, parlaying what I saw with what Dr. McGahey observed, and we both did as well to support, kind of offers unique perspectives as we go through this. So we kind of broke this down into kind of sharing our thoughts in kind of three respective ways. And so the first was kind of just highlighting how did we respond as a health system. And so a little bit of context. So as was mentioned, we are local here in Omaha, Nebraska, but our division at the time of the pandemic also constituted of Southwest Iowa, as well as the balance of the state of Nebraska. And so within those kind of respective markets or demographics or geographies, there's definitely varying levels of immigrant populations and refugee populations that we directly help support and serve, and saw those respective needs that were alluded to thus far. Between our two respective organizations, CIII and Creighton, we align currently and at the time as medical partners with between the two organizations. And so during the respective pandemic, really at the onset, the fact that we had that existing relationship and that partnership really kind of helped propel and spearhead our response in what I would say was probably a much more expeditious manner than perhaps if there wasn't those pillars and framework that existed there out of the gate. Being able to rely on the balance of the clinicians and the those clinicians that also serve as educators within Creighton really helped provide us with that platform of one, the means and through which to one serve, provide that direct patient care, but also get out in the community and provide respective education of what's the truth. Here's the data of what we're seeing. And I think Dr. McGahey will allude to a little bit of that here in just a minute too. But also there was a respective group kind of known as the Omaha Refugee Task Force. And that really was a group that comprises of various organizations, services, et cetera, that come together to really help, drive and provide that level of service that's required where we see those barriers, disparities, et cetera. And again, here in just a minute, we'll kind of highlight again who those kind of specific groups are that play a part in that as well. But in terms of partnerships, I think for me, this was probably one of the biggest things that we quickly developed outside of some of those existing partnerships. Again, for the one most simply being between CIII and Creighton, respectively. But naturally, it really brought on a deeper relationship with the Department of Health and Human Services, with the respective state organizations, with the resettlement agencies, and really having to work closely with them of what they're seeing and really try to expedite our response for what we're seeing as well. When it came to services or needs that we had to develop and so forth, it really, I know much of the notion or a lot of the name of the game early on in COVID was this race to meet a need for change, for new processes, et cetera. And that was no different in this regard. But I think we had to obviously keep the context of those that we were trying to serve in mind as we were doing it as well. We really kind of helped propel, and we were a leader in terms of screening protocols, and ultimately then when the vaccination came as well, outreach respective of that, really tried to develop models and plans of care that really allowed us to have flexibility in what we provided, whether it was individuals that came to seek us out at our existing brick and mortar healthcare locations, hospitals, clinics, et cetera, or it was our ability to go meet those respective populations in their community to provide that level of care, screening, education, et cetera. Really the modalities through which we were able to do that was varied, and really, again, was met mostly with the energy of our clinicians and teams to go do that work and really care for those that needed it respectively. And so I think the fact that we had such a timely response, but also one that met people in those different venues, really helped propel us to be seen as kind of a leader and help support those groups. One thing too that I think kind of highlights that expedited response. So Grand Island is a community in kind of east central Nebraska that has several large meat packing plants there. So obviously there's, large populations of refugees and so forth that work at those facilities. And within our geography, that was really the first place that was kind of identified and was a hotspot when COVID hit. And it ran rampant, and quickly our hospital that we have there was, really overrun with those that were hospitalized with COVID, and many of which required ventilator support in order to, really survive, for lack of a better way to put it. Well, what we quickly realized was that we didn't necessarily have a great depth of ventilator support. And so as a health system, we had to quickly organize ourselves as a way to try to distribute those ventilators out to Grand Island. And out of that immediate need, this probably all happened in the course of about 8 to 12 hours. We had to organize where we had ventilator support, create a transportation team that was able to get those items out to them on a timely basis. But then ultimately that kind of helped stick with us through the rest of the pandemic. When and where we needed to shift resources, we had those processes and things like that developed that we were able to do it really kind of at the drop of a hat. And it allowed us to really kind of work truly more as a respective group or system, as opposed to kind of in silos like perhaps we historically always did, where it was a specific community, specific hospital group or whatever that kind of always looked out for their respective community and patients. We really had to obviously come together in that regard. And then the last piece to quickly touch upon was, again, kind of, I mentioned it a little bit, but having to kind of come up with creative ways that we were able to, see those respective patients as well. So, one example that we highlight here is within our clinics, instead of having patients necessarily come into the respective clinic and so forth, we developed processes and things that we were able to do, whether it be drive up care or, screening in the parking lot and different things like that, that really were almost kind of ahead of that becoming a popular type of process or of sorts, in terms of, the idea being that it would allow us to obviously, one, keep those that don't need to come into the clinic in the event that they were ill. We were able to safely care for them in those settings. But then also in a lot of our clinics, we don't have, they're not able to, with an aerosol generating procedure, they're not able to, it takes time for those to turn over. So that way, again, they're safely to operate and use. And so, really it was just kind of an expansive approach of varying processes, and, healthcare looked very different during that time, but we were still achieving a lot of the same goals that we set out to do, respective of our populations that we serve. So I will turn over to Dr. McGahey to kind of talk about what we learned specifically as well.
Thank you, Cole. Okay, so the next slide. So as we first, and I think everybody in healthcare learned, whatever your pre-existing health disparity was, it was worsened by COVID. So worsened by the pandemic. And as we remember from the initial availability of COVID testing, the first testing that was available was limited to the hospital. And when testing was available in the community, it was available basically from the state. We started looking for state level data to see how our refugee population was being impacted. And we discovered that race, ethnicity, and even language data wasn't being collected by the state. And so that was one of the first things we were able to do, was to go back to DHHS and say, we have to have this demographic information to be able to know health information, to know health disparity. Later, we were able to see the information, and if you'll go to the next slide, to know this is Nebraska data. If you see the pink bar shows what is the population of different populations in Nebraska. So pink is the population of white Nebraskans versus the percentage of those who were affected by COVID. So 11% of Nebraskans are Hispanic, but 48% accounted for the number of COVID cases. So again, disproportionate representation of health disparity worsened by COVID. Going to the next slide. And so why was this, why were we why did we find ourselves in this position? Well, we have been part of the refugee resettlement process since 2008. Creighton University has had the contract with the state of Nebraska to do the refugee resettlement physical since 2008. And as a family medicine department and as a family medicine clinic, we have always embraced this as not refugee screening physicals, and then it's sort of the pro forma physical, and then that's the end of it, but rather comprehensive primary care. And we've always worked to continue to provide ongoing care for the refugee community. And while about 40 to 60% of our patients may come from the refugee community, and we represent about 20% of our, about 20 different languages in our community, in our clinic, excuse me, we're very quick to say that we're not a refugee clinic. We take care of all kinds of people. We're also a clinic that takes care of student health. We provide care for the Siena Francis location right next door. And so we really do pride ourselves on taking care of all comers. But because we've been taking care of people who have come to us through the refugee resettlement program since 2008, this is work that we've been invested in. Related to that, we have a couple of long-term employees in our clinic who are respected members of the refugee community. We have 3 interpreters who we are very quick to refer to our employees as our cultural navigators and our cultural ambassadors, and they are well respected within the community. And Jonathan and Purva particularly were people who came to us at COVID and were able to help us to be liaisons within the community. And my colleague was asked to present to the community and go out and do some public speaking and be able to basically be liaisons within the community. And so that gave us, again, we weren't just sort of showing up and saying, you know, COVID is here, how can we help? But we were already invested with the community. Cole was talking about the refugee task force. And so if you'll go to the next slide, what this was is that the mayor's office in 2008 actually established, and it's a non-formal organization of agencies. The charter is held by the 2 resettlement agencies in the middle, but there's representation from all of the different organizations who intersect with refugee work, and basically anybody can come to these meetings. They happen bi-monthly. And so throughout COVID, this was very important to be able to have these ongoing meetings too, to be able to say, what are the different things that we're seeing and experiencing? And this was a lot of the conversation that we were able to see related to how refugees were impacted by COVID. Next slide. So specifically, some of the things that we saw were that the people we were working with, inability to socially distance in the home. So if one person was ill, they didn't have necessarily their own bathroom or their ability to separate from other family members. As Cole was talking about in Grand Island, meatpacking, people working in meatpacking were about 10 times more likely to be sick compared with the general population. Distancing protocols were not necessarily followed. You can read about the USDA and some of the challenges with actually having safety protocols implemented in meatpacking. And so we were on the other side of that and trying to take care of our patients who a number of them work in meatpacking. We did see a lot of people who would medicate with Tylenol and ibuprofen so that they could sort of overcome the screening protocols to still get into work. And then recognizing that some of the screening things where you needed like phones or cars to get in to get screening, we had to help our patients to be able to navigate around that. So those were some of the challenges that we saw, and we're helping our refugee families to navigate. Next slide. And so just really quickly, what we would do differently, I think we definitely recognize and will continue to know the importance of trust building and being engaged with the community. But I think recognizing the importance of state and local advocacy, I think it's very easy to be working with our individual families, but recognizing the importance of what are the policies and procedures that are affecting employment and affecting data collection. And then also working with the agencies as they're decreasing staffing, because, you know, certainly with resettlement numbers going down temporarily, being able to work with our agencies. So it's been a great privilege to work with the community, and our work's not done. So I look forward to questions.
Thank you both very much for sharing that. I want to remind folks who are joining us by Zoom to please put questions, and I'm not sure if they go in the Q&A box or the chat box. In the chat box. So please put questions in the chat box, and please also share in the chat box what you may have learned, what your particular ministry or service area is, and what you may have learned as a result of the pandemic. I'd like to turn to Peg Harmon now, and Peg has been working in Tucson on the border with refugees for a long time. And Peg, can you share with us what your experience was and what the experience on the border was like, and what you've learned?
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm pleased to be able to present to you today. Here at Catholic Community Services, we provide three kinds of services for people to welcome the stranger. And one of those is our legal immigration program and citizenship. We provide refugee resettlement, placement, employment, and case management. And we also provide services for asylum seekers. These are the folks who are crossing the border and require shelter and care in order to reach their final destination. We paused our refugee resettlement program as a consequence of the Trump policies, and we just recently restarted it. But really, my focus today will be on the asylum seekers and the guests that we serve and assist as they are entering the United States and finding their final destination with their sponsors and families. Our program for this is called Casa de las Alitas. It's a House of Little Wings, with the understanding that we're hoping to provide people the means to move on to their final destination. Our work began in 2014, and at that time, we initiated this work because ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, had begun to leave people who had crossed, who they had received, at the bus station here in Tucson. So they received them, they processed them, and they left them at the bus station to kind of figure out what the next step in their journey was going to be. And we were called as Catholic Community Services to move forward and to work with our bishop to try to solve the issue of people being, again, left with nothing, no food, no water, no mechanism to spend the night anywhere, or to sleep in the street at the bus station. We had found that the number of people who we have been receiving has moderated over the years. And I just want to make a comment that, from that first 5 years where we may have served, hundreds of people in a month, those at that time, conditions then changed in Central and South America as well as in Mexico. And I think it's been mentioned earlier, those push factors modified. The climate change increased drought in some of our Central American countries. People were increasingly threatened by cartels. The cartels shifted their tactics for extortion to payment of mordida, to bribes for folks. Farmers no longer had the money to pay those bribes. And again, extortion and kidnapping became highly common. So then as a consequence of that, we started seeing in 2019, we received about 16,000 people in that year. But then as the Trump administration modified its policy and instituted what they affectionately call the Migrant Protection Protocol, or the Remain in Mexico protocol, as well as Title 42 expulsions, that calendar year, we received 1,500 people in the entire year. So you can see drastic modification. Again, was mentioned earlier, policy changes really changes what happens with migrants' decisions. I just wanted to take a brief minute and just mention Title 42. Most of you probably heard of it. And the reason I mention it is because it provides the context for us, the backdrop against which we've seen changes in the nature of the folks who are receiving. Now, Title 42 is part of the 1944 Public Health Act. Over the years, the authority to declare a Title 42 emergency shifted to the director of the CDC with the approval of the presidents. And the Title 42 declaration continues as long as the health official determines it is necessary. Now, that began in March of 2020, and then what are called exceptions to Title 42, which is why we continue to receive large numbers of people, and large numbers of people have now continued to come in 2021 and 22, is that the clarification of who is an exception included people with physical and mental illness, disability, a caregiver for a person with a physical illness or disability, lack of access to safe housing or shelter in Mexico, which those of you who've done this work know that there's almost no shelter and housing in Mexico for migrants. Mexico may refuse to receive the person in return, so they are released here. A woman is pregnant, the person is under the age of 21 or over 70 and traveling alone. And there's an indication that they've been threatened or harmed while they were in Mexico. Now, the CDC has already declared that Title 42 is no longer necessary, and it expired in May, but the administration hasn't lifted Title 42 as an operating procedure when evaluating people's entrance at the border. So then our numbers began to increase as and the nature of who we are receiving began to change. About 22,000 arrivals came to us during 2021. Our month of September looks like we're going to have about 6,000 to 7,000 arrivals, which kind of puts us on a track to be doubling the number of people we saw in 2020. Now, where the people are from, there are about 40 different countries that we've tracked over the years when we began taking that data. And people from Mexico are the lowest number. So it's a real shift from years ago, from the early years where people from Mexico were the majority. Now they are the smallest demographic, and people from Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela are really representing the highest demographic for country of origin. Again, these numbers change every single month. They almost change every single day. Now, where they go, oftentimes people are wondering, where do the folks go? People are joining sponsors who are typically family members who are paying for their journey from the border to the place of final destination. Most of our folks are headed to Florida, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Texas, and California. And again, if you think about it, the country of origin to those final locations is a predictor, right? Because they're joining family or friends, and they're joining people who are also from that same country of origin. And then we have, an example of that is we received about 40 folks in the month of August from Georgia, a country we had not really seen folks from. And all of those individuals were headed to New York. So that's an example of people are joining their family and friends as they move to their final destinations. I think it's important to note that Catholic Charities USA and other partners have been instituting something called the Borders Everywhere Project. And the reason for that is that we have a need to be able to hand off some of these people because they're going to need assistance beyond what we're able to do for them once we put them on their journey to their final destination. So we began with houses, and then over time, and this became even more important, we created a reception center with private living spaces that houses a couple hundred people. We created additional partnerships with other faith-based organizations to help us with overflow. And we also created partnerships and began to rent out hotels so that people could have places to remain while they're awaiting their travel plans. An essential element, of course, always for us has been medical services, food, shelter, clothing, that a case management, if you will, assistance with travel was important. But since the beginning, we've screened individuals for medical condition as part of our welcoming process. And people arrive with all sorts of medical conditions: dehydration, upper respiratory infections, lice, scabies, because of the nature of how they travel, gastrointestinal issues because they're consuming unsafe food and water. They can arrive with contagious diseases like measles and mumps, and that treatment requires quarantine. The nature of the medical conditions, as well as the ratio of people with medical conditions seems to vary by country of origin. So 100% of the guests from countries like Bolivia and Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, arrived with some sort of medical condition, and this was prior to COVID. The other thing that is of note is that prior to the implementation of Title II of 42 expulsion, 9% of our guests had a medical condition overall. You know, we had those specific spikes related to countries, somehow related to country of origin, but that number increased to 30% of all of our guests who were entering. So and it kind of makes sense. Again, Title 42 creates disability and medical exceptions for expulsion. So we created a relationship with our county health department, the hospital system, a federally qualified health center to create this screening and to provide telemedicine as well as other referral relationships to facilitate in-person care. So how did COVID change things? Well, we relied a lot on volunteers and on other kinds of support systems. And once that happened, once COVID happened, we pretty much lost our volunteers and we had to shift our model to a staffing model and create even stronger partnerships in the community. Our county health department helped us and stood up rapid testing of all guests as they entered shelter because when COVID was at its worst infection rates here in our community, it was critical for us to know if people were COVID positive, so we didn't create our own sort of mass infection opportunity there. And what's interesting is ICE only tests when they're in a detention center, only tests symptomatic people. So people could be released to us who were COVID positive. They're put on a bus with 50 other people. So one positive person being released, sent to us on a bus could create unknown numbers of infections. So we tested everybody as soon as they came. We did have some people refuse to test because they were concerned about side effects of the vaccination and were afraid that their opportunities to travel would be impaired. Our health department also worked. We offered vaccinations for everybody as they entered. Again, with the vaccinations, the majority chose to be vaccinated, even though they were concerned about the fact that they might have some reaction to that vaccination. So our positivity rate for COVID could soar some days to 40% of our entrants. And so we had to really drastically shift the methodology that we use to shelter people. And again, our health department helped us stand up quarantined hotel space with contracted medical providers who could care for symptomatic and ill persons. CDC guidelines were followed to determine the length of time for quarantine and treatment. And again, most of our guests cooperated with their requirements for medical recovery. Again, COVID added that layer of complications to services needed because, again, 30% of our guests who had come with some sort of disability and complication. So we had, and the kinds of presenting problems that were given to us were preterm labor, people who'd been tortured and who had hands and legs, feet removed. They had significant wounds of other kinds that were evidence of torture. Guests who had a disability had their medications removed from them by the ICE agents at the detention centers. And so they would come to us with active seizures. They would come to us in sort of an active episode of asthma, all kinds of conditions that are controlled by medications, babies who were failing to thrive, people who used wheelchairs with pressure sores, guests who had fallen off the wall as they were trying to climb the wall to enter and injuring their back. Also, people who tried to use the train La Bestia to come through this country of Mexico to reach the border would fall off and have serious injuries, including loss of limb. So as I mentioned, many of these diagnoses as well were a consequence of people being unhoused or in improper housing situations as they made your journey. So what did we learn? I think the most important thing we learned, other than the fact that we needed the kinds of partnerships that we created over this time, was that all of our guests have experienced trauma. The trauma that forced them from their homes to journey with really unimaginable danger and disrespect, the risk from traffickers who exploit them physically, financially, and sexually, not being able to trust law enforcement, who also exploit them during their journey in various countries. We had to learn how to listen to that trauma and offer whatever mental health and emotional support we could during their short stays. And the average length of stay is 2 overnights with us. So that gives you a sense of what a short time that can be. We knew we had to establish places for quiet, for children and adults to join in activities such as art projects. We provided a chapel and options for religious services. And really important was that our shelters all provide private spaces for sleeping. So when it's a family migrating, that the family can remain together and have that sense of safety and security as they're together. I think relationships and trusts are essential, and we learned that our protocol for receiving people always had to be welcoming, even though we were testing them. We offered food, we offered water, we offered toys for children, opportunities for them to use telephones to call family members, either in this country or their country of origin. We created medical information guidelines. Many of our guests are indigenous language speakers, and so they often don't have a language in common or much language in common with others. So we had to create tools that would help providers diagnose the issues that are associated with our folks and to facilitate diagnosis and treatment. So I think in the end, our biggest takeaway is that we needed to be sure that we always treated people with dignity, respect, and kindness, because those elements of our care are as critical as the medical services in order to assure healing and recovery. And I'm open to any question that anybody has.
Thank you very much, Peg, and Amy and Cole and Jacqueline. You've given us a lot to think about, and I really appreciate your sharing your experiences. Let me turn first and see if we have any questions queued up from our Zoom colleagues. I don't see any there. Okay. Well, if anybody here has a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand. And while you're thinking, I'm going to throw a question back, a general question, which I'll tailor for each. And that is, we've talked about what you learned, but what are you going to take with you going forward? So, and Jacqueline, in your case, you mentioned some of the structural problems that that your data have illuminated. How can we go forward with that, either in terms of your next steps on research or what it tells you about what we need to do from an advocacy or service delivery perspective?
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I think this pandemic really just highlighted all of the existing problems in our migration policies. And if I could just highlight 5 quickly. One is we need to address all of the practical barriers that limit migrants' access to benefits and services, that limit their access to social safety nets, where they're excluded, and also where they're practically excluded in the sense that they aren't familiar with systems or they're excluded due to language barriers. Kind of take every step we need to reduce those practical barriers. Secondly, we need to make sure that detention centers are meeting health and safety protocols. We learned that during the pandemic. We should have known that already, and we should implement that going forward. Thirdly, we need to expand legal pathways to both for protection and for filling labor shortages. Like, we have an aging population. We need to make sure we have the workers we need to fill the jobs we need, but also we need to ensure that we, complying with global compacts in the sense that we in global conventions, and that we're providing the protection that we say we're going to. We need to really address misinformation about migrants and their contributions. I think this pandemic really highlighted the essential nature of their contributions to our economy. So really combating the narrative, I think, is something we learned, highlighting their contributions rather than, portraying them in a xenophobic light, I think is something we learned going forward. And also the need to strengthen our data capacity, really, because, they were saying they weren't even tracking, for example, language or race at the beginning of COVID. We really need to strengthen our data capacity going forward. I think those are 5 kind of key structural things we learned from the pandemic that existed already, and this just highlighted them in a very evident light, and we need to fix them going forward.
You mentioned, and it's been mentioned a couple times, about the role that immigrants, documented or undocumented, played in providing essential services. And this is an unfair question to ask, but I'll ask it anyhow. Do you think that awareness is going to have lasting change? Like, do you think people recognize that these are, these are folks who are contributing to the well-being and the common good of our country, and that, is there any hope that even subtly that may help change some attitudes and ripple into policy?
I think one way that it can is everyone is really fearful of supply chain issues right now, and the price effects of it. And if you can combat that narrative by showing, like, the reason that we have supply chain issues is labor supply issues, and one way that we can fill that is by filling those labor gaps, that really will help combat that narrative, I think. And I think it, like any, good impact, it will fade with time, the essential nature, everyone appreciated the nurses during the healthcare crisis, and now, we forget, it will fade with time. But I think especially now with supply chain issues, if we can highlight that immigrant labor is needed, it will help,
Cole and Amy, I wanted to put a version of that question to you. So you've talked about your experience, you've talked about what you learned, the lessons you took from the care you gave and how you had to give it during the pandemic. Are there specific things that you're talking about now in terms of getting ready for the next pandemic or the next public health crisis? Are there ways that what you've learned has changed how you deliver services and how you think about being ready?
I'll go first, Dr. McGahey, and then I'll let you offer your perspective as well. So, I think, kind of related to your question there, and actually the one you just asked prior, I think the thing that kind of immediately has stuck with me, and it's so simplistic, I think, to some extent, in terms of an idea or a thought. But as an organization, we help the state with their drive-through testing initiative. And one of the things, Dr. McGahey alluded to, obviously, that it's disparity that existed with, access to those that even had a vehicle to be able to drive through and so forth, but, access to the internet to even register and things like that. But at the very basis of it, the entire platform and a lot of through which we do is solely in English. And very little that we have is in multiple languages. Even something that we advocate for is our health records in multiple languages. And, we have, the ability for those that can access their health records through an app and stuff like that. So if they had that capability, they would be able to see their test results. And there's so much that we build process and systems around, and a lot of it is in a singular language, which is English. And even if we had something like that, so as we look at new processes, new things like that, I think honestly at its foundation or its core is being mindful of how we can have it in multiple languages from the get-go would make a large difference. Even our education that we put out, a lot of times it always lagged in terms of those other languages that we tried to present it in. And it made a difference in time, but so much of what we did and so much for perhaps the next, health pandemic crisis that comes is time is everything. So if we have that at our fingertips out of the gate, it'll just make us much more effective in terms of caring for those that are coming to us for care. Dr. McGay, I don't know if you have a different perspective or thoughts.
I think we're already getting the opportunity to practice our skill set again with monkeypox. One of our colleagues in the clinic has a large population of people he cares for who are living with HIV. And so with the monkeypox and then the vaccine that's been available, he was a key person who the community targeted to say, you know, can we work with you to identify people who are at risk and get the vaccine out? And so I think we had already sort of practiced our muscle building skills, our muscle memory to be able to say, you know, can we reach people quickly and figure out how to get people in and sort of make the case for, you know, would you be interested in getting this vaccine? And, you know, so fortunately or unfortunately, we're already getting the opportunity to kind of practice outreach for the newest sort of opportunity to respond to something. So that's that. I think that what we approach, I think, is just really trying to be a good steward and a good partner because with decreased resettlement numbers, both because of federal resettlement numbers that had gone down with the Trump administration and then with COVID. And then there was such a huge number of people who had come in very quickly with Afghanistan. We had families of 14 and 15 who were coming in one afternoon. And we had we had to really work with the state to say we were going to have like 4 days of just a lot of people that we were going to work to accommodate really quickly. And we were committed to being good partners and saying, you know, what can we do to get people taken care of? And so we've really, I think, just said, we're committed to being good stewards and being good partners and really, you know, just being compassionate and meeting people where they are. And I think that that's helped us, again, just continue to live our mission, because it's not about, it's saying what is it that needs to be done today. And I think that I alluded to this, but I don't think I did a very good job of really emphasizing that. I mentioned our employees that we've hired, but Cole and our clinic managers have done a good job of actually continuing to recruit people. So we've had a number of medical assistants who we've recruited from the community, who are from our different refugee populations, who are medical assistants and work in the front desk and different things like that. So I think that really helps us to stay grounded and responsive to the community.
Thank you. I think we do actually have a question from the Zoom folks. I'm going to hand the mic over.
So we are running short of time, so this will be the last question. But I believe this was for Peg Harmon. This is from one of our virtual participants. This is DJ Griffin from give me one moment. From El Paso. And she wanted from SSJ Las Americanas, and she wanted to know if you could share any insights and practical suggestions regarding trauma-informed self-care for your staff, volunteers, personally, and as a team. Thank you.
So one of the advantages we have here at Catholic Community Services is that we have a behavioral health component to the work that we do broadly in the Diocese of Tucson. So we have internal experts on establishing trauma-informed care and assessment of environments related to trauma-informed care. So our staff and volunteers have access to individual and or group opportunities to process the kinds of challenges that they face. And as I shared with you, many of these challenges are significant because the people who join us are highly traumatized. So, and one of the things that happens to people who work with folks who are highly traumatized is they incorporate that trauma into their own interactions and their own capacities. So we establish opportunities for our staff and our volunteers to have guided group discussions and guided individual discussions about the trauma they're experiencing, what challenges they're having in completing the work. And I spoke briefly about the design of the environment and how we set up the environment to reduce the trauma as people come to us, our guests, so that their sensibility to threat or danger that they've just experienced is reduced by the kind of environment. We have artwork, we have comfortable furniture, we have all kinds of opportunities for us to kind of reduce the challenges. And then finally, one of the things that we did just this summer is that we engaged with a consultant from the University of Arizona to do an external look at how we're managing our trauma-informed work, particularly as we support the staff and the volunteers, because I don't think you can have too much information about how to be protective for the folks who are doing this amazing work.
Thank you very much, Peg. And thanks also to Jacqueline and Amy and Cole for all the wonderful things you shared with us. And as I was listening and digesting all of this, I think 3 things I took away. One is community relationships, communication, and compassion. So maybe what we learned from COVID-19, we have some new processes and ways of doing things, but maybe what we learned from COVID-19 is what we knew all along, that we need to always attend to and deepen our relationships with our partners and our communities, that we need to make sure we're communicating, if that means language access, if that means listening to our employees and what they're suffering, and we need to always have compassion. And if we keep cultivating those, then as Amy said, when the next thing hits, we'll just jump in and get it done like we did this time. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.